Yes, counting down the hours to the NFL draft. It is almost upon us after all the hype, months of talk, speculation. We'll finally get to find out who the Bills and the rest of the NFL are going to take. I'm Andy Young with the Buffalo End Zone podcast. Special guest joining us today because Kevin Carroll is out with a ruptured eardrum. Probably enough of hearing about wide receivers kind of caused that. ESPN's Bills beat reporter Alaina Getzenberg. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm not the best circumstances to be here, but, happy to step in and plenty to talk about.
We would have had you anyways, but now you're going to take even a bigger role.
I'm here. I'm ready to do it.
People want to hear what you have to say more than Kevin anyways.
Well, listen, there is no shortage of things to talk about. So
all right, so
here to do it.
Yeah, everybody is talking about wide receiver with the Buffalo Bills. Is that the glaring hole? Is that the need? Is that exactly what everyone says it is to you?
Yes. I think there's two ways about it. Yes, it's as simple as that wide receiver is such a need that we're at a point where it's okay, look at the room and it's not great at the moment. There's definitely Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, they're exciting, they're good options, but I also think we're at a point where it's you need more. Stephon Diggs isn't there, Gabe Davis isn't there. So I do think it's as big as a need as people say, but I also think there is the room for put out a story today that was okay, but they could also do something else in the first round, and we all need to that is a possibility if the board doesn't fall, if they can't execute a trade, which I'm sure we'll get into. But there are other needs that this team has. There are many of them, but wide receiver is it's wide receiver, and then there's a gap, and then there's everything else because they just haven't addressed it in the way that the other positions they've really in a big way in free agency safety, it's re-signing Taylor Rapp, it's bringing in Mike Edwards, but at wide receiver it's you sign Curtis Samuel. Mac Hollins is a nice option to have, but
right.
There isn't really okay, this would be your starters at this moment. They don't have that there, in my opinion. So yes.
What did you make of Brandon Beane's comments last week that the Bills didn't necessarily need that true alpha dog, number one, Steph Diggs type of wide receiver? Because to me, that's kind of just hedging his bets a little bit in case that doesn't work out in this draft, and they're going to have to get by without that. Maybe they take a guy in the second or third round for whatever reason, and that player isn't an immediate alpha dog, number one type of receiver. He can't go out there and say, we have to have that or we're going to struggle. They're going to have to get by either way.
Yeah, I think I agree with your point because I think the problem is we just sat here and said, wide receiver is such a need. Well, all 31 other teams know that the Bills need a wide receiver. So I also think, yes, it's him being if we don't get out of there with, the number one guy, there's the possibility that, and we'll get into it, but, there's wide receivers that they could take, let's say at 28, that aren't necessarily, number one wide receivers, a Stephon Diggs, direct replacement. Some of these guys are gonna be better in the slot, and that's not necessarily your number one wide receiver. So that's possible, but it's also yes, that every other team knows you need a wide receiver. You don't want to exactly sit up there and be my biggest hole is wide receiver, and that is all I can draft because then who's gonna trade? If I was a different team, I'd be whatever you want to trade for, it's high because I know you need this, so I'm gonna make my asking price higher. So I think it's a combination of things, but it's also it's the season where you're not saying exactly what your plans are.
Right. That brings us to exactly trading up, and there's so many people that think that's a fun idea, while the analytics community and a whole lot of other people would say it's just short-sighted to trade up that much. If you have to go way up high, into the top 10 to get the guy you want for a position that's not a quarterback. What do you think about the idea of maybe moving into the top 10? If they were to do so, what would be your favorite idea there?
I think there's certainly the scenario where it works is so we're getting into a spot where if you're doing that, you're okay with getting rid of next year's first. And the only reason, I've started warming up to this more lately, hearing, it's something that has been thrown out more and more. I think lately our colleague Joe B at The Athletic brought it up to me yesterday that it was this idea of okay, what if they did make this big move on his podcast? And I was I guess I kind of see it because we know that Brandon Beane is comfortable getting rid of a first-round pick for a top wide receiver because he did it with Stephon Diggs. And during his press conference last week, he was talking about how when he was in Carolina and they did it, he kind of was not comfortable with how it worked out and all that stuff. But then at the end of it, he's But unless you're getting like a Stephon Diggs, like that worked out okay for the first round pick. So I think it's absolutely on the table. Odunze is certainly like that would be an exciting wide receiver for the Bills that I think would be worthwhile trading up for. I have really mixed feelings about it because I think you can get really talented wide receivers so much later in the draft. And we've seen like Stephon Diggs wasn't a first round pick. Like there's a lot of really good wide receivers, the best wide receivers in the league right now that were not drafted early. So I have mixed feelings about giving up a lot for it. But I like, would Alaina Getzenberg, the general manager, do it? I think probably not because I don't want to lose next year's first, not knowing what injuries, what the situation will be next year. Will Brandon Beane, the general manager, do it? I could see it because he's that aggressive.
The thing that's different to me about the Stephon Diggs trade was Josh Allen was on a rookie contract at that point. So obviously they had to pay Diggs, and you're not going to have to pay a rookie wide receiver that much, but you also don't have then that asset to continue replenishing your team because Josh is going to take up, a quarter of your salary cap at that point or more, right? Yeah. So that's one difference to me, but the past shows that Brandon Beane is certainly willing to do that. I think, almost only but 2 of his drafts has he not traded up and made some kind of move to do something like that. So I think it's in his blood to try to do it. I just don't know that I would want to give up what in essence is maybe if it takes you a first and a second this year and a first and a second next year to get to, say, 6, right, with the Giants to take Neighbors or Odunze or Harrison, whoever your flavor is of those 3, and then say that guy is then equal to what in essence is probably 4 starters over the next 2 years. That's just a real big haul for me. So I can get around to it and I can have fun with it. Like in 2014 when the Bills, and this is a different regime, traded up for Sammy Watkins to get up to number 4, I was all for it. I'm like, do it. Let's have at it. And the Bills were in a completely different spot at that time, trying to elevate an unproven quarterback in E.J. Manuel. Obviously, that didn't work out. But I was telling Kevin last week, who was it that cleaned up that mess from Sammy Watkins? It was Brandon Beane in his very first summer as general manager, trading him away. So we'll see how that all works out. Is if they do move into the top 10, do you favor any of the 3, the big 3 we call them, and Marvin Harrison Jr., Rome Odunze from Washington, and Malik Neighbors from LSU? Do you have a top 3 there, a number 1 of the top 3?
I mean, I think if Marvin Harrison was available, that would be like, whoa.
Right.
I think he's the top of that for me, but he seems like so unrealistic for the Bills being there just because I think he's going to be taken too high that, like, you can't give up, kind of like what you're saying. Like, to give up a certain amount is crazy. And I think for him it would just be, like, everything we're here. Like, that seems to be a consistent theme is that he's going to be the first one. He should be. You never know. At this point, like, who knows what's going to happen? I give up. But
you'd have to go to, like, 4
but you'd
for
have
him.
to go to, like,
4 at worst 5.
5 because it depends how these quarterbacks fall, right? Which is, like, all over the place with the reports. So who knows? But it's too high. I think that would be too high. But I think Odunze is my next. Like, I think that could make sense. I think if that 9 pick with the Bears we were talking about is kind of like, that's a spot where it's like, what are the Bears going to do? Do they want another wide receiver for Justin Fields? Would they like to get more picks in this year's draft? They don't have that many. Like, that's a spot where then it gets interesting. But yeah, so that to me, he would be the guy. I mean, Marvin Harrison seems like a pipe dream, and like just it's going to be way too much to move from 28 to like 5.
Right.
I think is too much. But I think Odunze, like, that would be like, depending on where he falls, could be a good fit.
And it seems to me, and I don't know if this is just draft smoke or just the season we're in because people want to talk about these things, that Odunze's stock is even maybe rising a little bit more right now because people thought, oh, maybe he'll fall to 9 or 10, or maybe you could get him at 12 if he slips a little bit. It seems like a lot of people are talking about him maybe even being ahead of Neighbors. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I think there is some stuff where it's like, it depends where these teams have them, I guess, at this point. And I think the important part of this is, like, we're going to have all these conversations like been having. It's been for the last couple months. But there's a part of this that, like, we as people on the outside, and like Brandon Beane alluded to this some, even when talking about Josh Allen and like how he gives his opinion on who they should draft. And it's like, okay, like, thanks, Josh. Like, that's good. Like, they like to have that. But at the other hand, it's like, unless you're like in those meetings, like if you're someone who's like, okay, we saw how he interacted with his teammates in this situation, or we saw how he interacted with the people in our building. Like, to me, that's a part of it with like, and of course then the medicals. Like, there's stuff about these wide receivers that each team's going to have differently, because there's we know that the Bills value like that character piece highly, and like in his press conference last week, Brandon Beane talked about having someone who is selfless, in this, who they want to draft and at the wide receiver position. So that's something where it's like, I don't know how the Bills perceive, like that's a hard thing to quantify without like being in those meetings and that kind of thing. So that's why I think when we're like, okay, which wide receiver, it's like, well, this team, he might have like really pissed someone off like in that building, and like we don't know, that kind of thing, X wide receiver. So that to me is why we're like, okay, this guy could be here, this guy could be here. But to me, like fit wise with the Bills, based on all we know, Odunze would make more sense. And like, again, he could end up going way higher, like to your point, like who knows, like Neighbors could drop, so we don't, it's right. Also, I'm sorry, this is not like a very like this will happen kind of thing, but that's what this draft to me feels like. It could go so many ways, and like I feel like we probably said that last year too, but this one really does. This first round could go like all over the place, and I think that's a credit to like there's some really, all of these, like I think all three of those guys, like it seems like could have been number ones in other classes, and that shows the talent of this wide receiver class too.
Yeah, for sure. Always love to hear from our listeners and viewers. Roy Collins chiming in on YouTube. He says, I believe you only trade away that many picks for a QB, not a wide receiver. And we've certainly made the case, and we've heard that over the years. So, sharp comment there from Roy. Okay, so say they don't move into the top 10 to get one of those three guys. Is there a middle deal that you like where they could move into maybe the teens or earlier in the 20s to grab a guy that is maybe a tier below but still worthy of being a first-round pick?
Yeah, I think it's Brian Thomas Jr., and like that's it. Like to me, that's like it's him, and like where he falls, because I think he'd be a really good fit for the Bills. Like it depends where he goes, like how high the Bills would have to move up, but like he could make sense. It's just because we've seen, right, these last 2 years, we saw Beane make these mini trades up. Like, they're not, like, they weren't huge. He didn't have to give up a lot. But they were, like, he did trade up twice in a row.
Maybe he has to give up a fourth or a fifth rounder or something like that.
And that's where they have, like, this fourth that they got from the comp pick that they wanted to be a third, which, like, really does, like, have a huge, huge impact. Like, I don't think we can, like, negate like how big of a deal that is to go from thinking they had a late third to a late fourth, especially when it comes to trades like this where it's like he doesn't have a third to use to bargain with, but yeah, so giving up a fourth, a fifth, maybe a fourth and a sixth, something like that to move up, let's say 3-4 spots. I think that is something that would be almost too on brand. Like it would be like, well, yeah, you did it the last 2 years, so like of course you will. But it's interesting because I think we've seen like varying results. Obviously, Kaiir Elam still has a career to play out, and like we don't want to say too early, but obviously he hasn't been able to get on the field recently. So how that trade up worked out, Dalton Kincaid's still to be seen. So I think for me, if Brian Thomas Jr. was like in a certain spot, it would be worth trading up for. But like how he falls is another one where it's like there's teams in the teens that need a wide receiver and could take him, or they go with a different position of need and he ends up dropping like pretty like in that reachable range. So he's going to be an interesting one.
And he's a guy that even if he's not immediately a number one wide receiver, your alpha dog that does everything, that's your X guy. That's your guy on the outside that can get down the field. Big target that represents something that the Bills don't really have. Mac Hollins is a little taller, but I don't think people are expecting him to be a massive impact player this season. He's more, to my mind, like in a Trent Sherfield role. Like he can play some special teams. He can fill in the different positions as needed. So I like the idea of Brian Thomas Jr. I can be convinced of a lot of these guys, and I don't know the negatives as much. I mean, obviously you know about certain guys' size, right? Or maybe they're not as fast or whatever. But Brian Thomas Jr. is a guy I think if you can get up, late teens, early 20s, maybe you grab him. But I've seen boards where he's going up too to like 12.
Yeah.
Right? It's
or
crazy.
He's like dropping to 28, and it's like, well,
Right.
which one is it? Like,
Right.
he's in such a wide range that I think like that's why he's like prime like trade up category to me if they don't want to go like so high up, because it could be very attainable. You know, like that could be like a very digestible trade where they feel like they got a wide receiver that helps that room, didn't have to give up too much, but he's like there is a perceived talent gap right between him and those three guys ahead of him, and then there seems to be a gap between him and the next group. So it's like an interesting navigating that is fascinating, and it's all like, I don't know. I also think that's like the good point too of like that's why it's important, I think, to be like, if the Bills don't walk out of this draft with like he is Stephon Diggs right now, like he's in that role right away. That feels unrealistic to be like, that's exciting, and that would be really cool if they got like one of those big names. But they also may just walk away with like one or two or who knows, three guys that make their wide receiver room better, and that might be okay. And then you have to see how those guys develop and that kind of thing.
And you have more years. There's more drafts to find people. If that doesn't work out, you draft another one next year, and maybe that guy turns into your number one, or the guy you take in the 4th round this year somehow turns into your number one. Steph Diggs was a 5th round pick, right? Like it all works its way out one way or another. For YouTube user, the Bills own AFC. He says Malik Neighbors or Adunze make a deal with the Pats or Commanders. You're going up to 2 and 3?
I would not. No. That's a little too steep for me. I also think those teams really want quarterbacks, and let them take their quarterbacks and then let the wide receivers fall as they may.
That feels like you're giving up the Ricky Williams Saints draft to get up that high and give up your whole draft.
I don't view like wide receiver is a very important position and they need to add to it. I think that's putting a value on it that like someone else had said, like you do that for a quarterback. Like that to me is like, that would make sense, but especially like I think it really is important to keep in mind this is like a very talented wide receiver class. So like while the talent levels differ, there is a lot of promise later on that like guys we don't even talk that much about because they're not going to go in the 1st or 2nd round. Like later on, day 3 guys that like could still be exciting. So
yeah, I mean this is a draft where even if you don't get that true number one immediately right away, you probably still even can afford to draft 2 wide receivers. You lost. You lost a couple of big guys. You can say what you want about Gabe Davis, but he played a ton of meaningful snaps for this team, made a lot of big plays over the years. I think he had like 80 targets last year. Steph was like 150. So you're talking 230 targets that need to get spread around now between the rest of the people that they have. So, I mean, just because you don't necessarily get one of those top 3 guys doesn't mean you're not going to get a good player who can contribute. Okay, so we've talked about kind of that mid-tier trade. What if they stick to 28 and there's a couple receivers there? How do you feel about that situation?
So in that situation, again, this is me. I don't know if I could see Brandon Beane wanting to walk out of that room. He says he's interested in trading back. Like that's a possibility, but
he's never done it in the 1st round.
I think he would like to. He also talks about how he likes to put his head down at the end of the first day of the draft with a guy. So I think I think that would be a great scenario, though, sitting at 28 for them to trade back. I don't think we'll see, of course, it depends which teams are willing to trade up, of course. But I don't think we're going to see, like, those 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, like, not 32, till 30, to 32. Like, all those, like, be wide receivers. So, like, to me, that's, like, there is then an opportunity for, like, not one of those guys, to me, is, like, a perfect fit for the Bills, where it's, like, they're all good, and I think they can come and contribute. But to me, like, looking at, like, how I view those wide receivers, I think it's, like, you could let the board fall and let a couple guys get taken. If they do, that's okay, because there's a few that, like, are all pretty much in a similar range and could be a positive addition to this team. Whereas, like, I think Brandon Beane would love to get, like, picks to, like, have, like, what if you could then trade back, have a pick early in the 2nd, and then use what you got from that to trade up again in the 2nd or trade up in the 3rd and, like, get some guys. I think, like, the talent early 2nd could be really exciting. So then maybe you move up from 62 and grab 2 guys early in the 2nd. Like, I think that opens up more possibilities. But, of course, there are very exciting wide receivers at 28. And then there's other players, too,
right.
that don't play wide receiver that could be available at 28 that could help this team. So that's why if they don't trade up, that's when I think, like, anything could happen because it depends how the board. That's like the true like limitless possibilities because depending on how the board falls, they could take an offensive lineman.
Mm-hmm.
They could take a safety. Cooper DeJean is like a very Sean McDermott kind of pick.
Versatile.
Loves an Iowa
gritty,
guy.
right.
Yes, gritty. Yes, all of that stuff. It's only that he didn't wrestle that like doesn't fit the bill. So, yeah, and I mean the positions we can go through those too, like where they could address. But that to me is like 28 or back, like opens the door to like doing many different things, and it's not necessarily wide receiver, even though it very much so could be. And I think that's maybe the most likely scenario, but it opens the door to trading back and addressing if a guy they love who does not play wide receiver is there. I really do think they would take that guy, and like they recognize that there are other needs on this team.
For sure. I am starting to think that some team may look at Xavier Worthy's 4.2 140 speed and breaking the record and take him way higher than we think and take him in the teens or even higher than that. All it takes is one team to say, oh my God, this guy is Tyreek Hill or whatever, right? We're going to have the fastest guy in the league. But I think he's been a popular choice for people, and I think its steam is building to that, at least in the social media realms of Bills fandom and observers, that Xavier Worthy could be a choice. Small guy, but he's the fastest guy we've ever seen run in the combine. Our station in Texas sent us some video last night of highlights of his from down on the field, which is different than you watch like the broadcast stuff, and like it's crazy how fast that guy is. So, but does that translate into the NFL? Like, is he too small to like? He'll have a role in the league for sure, but is he worth 28 or higher to you?
Yeah, Andy and I were talking about this before we got started, but we had I'll plug here. We had an ESPN NFL Nation mock draft.
No shame in the game.
Yeah.
Either. Do it.
Which I am a part of. I picked for the Bills. You can find the written version of the mock draft on ESPN.com. I hate plugging. Seems like anyway. We're plugging ESPN.com. And I was
Never heard of it.
I was in a spot where I was not allowed to trade up or back. I had to pick a 28, and Brian Thomas Jr. had gone off the board. And I went with Xavier Worthy. And this decision, why, if I could have traded, I would have traded back. Just given, because wide receivers were, like Brian Thomas Jr. was gone in the top 3, and that was it. So to me, it was like, okay, I have an opportunity here to like move back and flexibility. But why I did choose Xavier Worthy is because I think we've heard a lot of times Brandon Beane, Sean McDermott reference that like having speed is something that would be lovely. Like that's something that would be good for this team. And the prospect of, yes, he doesn't block maybe as well as they would like at the line of scrimmage. You know, there's issues. He's like definitely on the smaller side. You know, like he's not perfect. Like you said, like he's small and it's whatever. He's not. But to me, like why I decided to go with him was because of that speed and because of like, I just imagine like the possibilities that could create with like the opening up other receivers in the middle of the field, but also like, can you imagine Josh Allen with someone who can run a 4.2? Like that's
right.
Like it just opens up doors, and to me that's exciting and unique and like could be a really interesting pairing. But, you know, it's like, where is he actually playing? And, like, there's question marks with it, which is why I was hesitant to be like, I guess he'll be my pick. But to me, that's why, back to my point, I think trading back makes sense. Because there's these guys where, like, we don't know. Like, the Bills might be, like, looking at a guy like Xavier Worthy and be like, this is how we would use him, and he would fit perfectly in this. But it's hard to project that because he doesn't have, like, quite the fit of someone we've seen in this Bills offense before. They haven't had speed like that. Like, I mean, no one has. But so it's an interesting thing where it's, like, how they would use him becomes the question mark. But he's definitely an exciting fit. And then there's also a list of other guys that, like, I mean, Adonai Mitchell and Xavier Leggett, which, like, great accent, by the way. Like, he'd be really fun. Like, a real Southern guy like Brandon Beane. So, like, do we need more of that? Probably.
Some Carolina boys.
Yeah, so I do think he would be an exciting fit. But I would be really, if he goes early, that would be, like, nuts. Like, just, that's just shows that, like, he could. Like, there could be a team that's in love with him at, like, the late teens. Like, you just don't know where, like, they want that speed and they covet that, and then a guy like that goes off. That's like a quality that's so unique that he has that makes it harder to be like, and he will go right here and like that kind of thing.
It reminds me a little bit of, obviously this was a completely unfortunate situation how this all panned out, but when the Raiders took Henry Ruggs higher than like a Jerry Jeudy or some of the other guys in that draft who were thought to be better just because he had that blazing speed. And some team, the Raiders often, love that aspect of play. So you could certainly see that. There's a list of like 15 wide receivers that
seems to grow every day.
Right. So I don't want to name every single one of them and go through all of them, but say the Bills follow through on your proposed idea that they trade back into the second round and maybe pick up a pick or something like that. Who are some of the guys that you like? You mentioned some of them a couple of minutes ago, but say they move to like 38 or something like that. Who's a second round receiver that you like if they don't take the pick at 28?
Yeah, I think Xavier Legette, if he was to, I don't know, like that's the thing. It's like, would he fall? We don't, maybe. Like, I think he would make a lot of sense. Keon Coleman is someone who's been getting, like, now he's kind of getting more attention. Like,
I like Ladd McConkey, too.
Oh, yes.
Super interesting player.
That is another one. Yep, Ladd McConkey. Like, so there's a lot of guys who it's like, okay, they're really interesting fits. That's to me why it's like, right, we could probably think of like 4 more that it's like, oh yeah, that would be
that
interesting.
Could be a second round guy. Yeah.
Adonai Mitchell's a really interesting one because he seems to be maybe falling a little bit lately, but like I don't know if he'd fall that far, and it's like it depends where the Bills would trade back to on him. He's a very interesting one to me because it's like he's got a lot of qualities that like seemingly would fit the Bills, but like he could go before they pick at 28. Like that's where like his range, he seems like a first round guy, so probably not him later. But yeah, I think there's a mix. That's probably like the top 3 that come to mind, but there's certainly others that could make sense later. And also like, again, I would not be mad if they walk out of like, let's say they trade back and they get, I don't know, like a offensive tackle, and then they get a wide receiver later in the second. Like, I just think there's like so many ways they can go about this, and I know it will be very disappointing if they don't leave the first day without a wide receiver. I can acknowledge that from a fan perspective. Like, I get it. Like, I really do. Like, because I think in many ways it would be like, okay, are they like just not going to address this? So that's my like where it's like I can also see like why it feels. I'm hesitant almost to be like they could trade back because it seems like they want to get that guy too. Like that's there.
And we talked a little bit about it, and it's so hard as this wide receiver train is moving so fast to jump off it. But we'll do it for a minute, right? To disappoint everyone out there, right? Say they stay at 28, and you mentioned Cooper DeJean a little bit earlier. Some of the positions or guys that you like that are not wide receiver that could make sense. I think you mentioned it. Safety or DB could make some sense. Yeah. Anything on the defensive line, we see Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane perpetually invest in the defensive line. I think they could use some younger edge help. They could certainly use some younger defensive tackle help. And if a great offensive tackle or offensive guard falls to them, maybe that's a possibility as well. Sure,
center. If like, you know, they're moving Connor over to center, Connor McGovern, but like, I don't know. They could still use a young center. Like that wouldn't be wild to me at all. Tackle Spencer Brown is entering the last year of his rookie deal. They do need, and you know, then he'll have to be, depending on the season goes. He's coming off his best season. You got to pay him. Someone's got to pay him. Do the Bills want to pay him? That's like becomes a question mark. So that's why that would make sense. Defensive tackle. They don't really have. Daquan Jones is very talented, and I think it was the right move to re-sign him. He is 32 years old.
Yes.
Like, that is very important to remember.
Coming off a big injury, too.
Yes. And, like, I think that was the right move. But that's what and last year, which I think is very important to remember, after the draft, Brandon Beane said that they wanted to get a defensive tackle, and it just didn't fall that way. So we do know that is a desire of theirs to have a young defensive tackle because they wanted it in last year's draft, and they did not address it. And that didn't go well, right? Like they needed help at that position that they did not have they didn't have a young guy really to step in when Daquan Jones went out, and that impacted them. So I think that's a position that like if they address that early, like that would day 1 or day 1, but like day 2, absolutely. Like of course we have to see if they get a 3rd round pick. Safety Cooper DeJean, of course, is like I think he might now. It seems like he could go like earlier. Like I don't know. Right. I don't know where he's going, but who knows? But certainly someone they had in for a 30 visit, which use with a grain of salt. Sometimes that's just to explore injuries and different things like that. But they did have him in. And then edge. Certainly is a position that we all know Brandon Beane loves to address.
And I think they need to at some point.
Sure.
We know about Von Miller's situation.
Yep.
Like, he struggled last year coming off that injury.
Mm-hmm.
He's older now, makes a lot of money, and they don't really have a whole lot. Like, they re-signed A.J. Epinesa. Greg Rousseau could get the fifth-year option, and he's good, but I wouldn't say he's a great player right now. He's been good for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then beyond that, it's kind of light. Like, Casey Toohill and Kingsley Jonathan, like, they could use an injection of young talent there too, I think.
Yeah, and we've heard from Sean McDermott a lot, like way more than in the amount we've only talked to him like 2-3 times since they re-signed AJ Epinesa, but there has been such an emphasis on like he has to step up.
Right.
Like they need him to take that next step, which is part of why they re-signed him. They believe he can. But they have to see him actually do it. And there's an extent to that where it's like, okay, there's confidence there, but you haven't seen him do it for a full season. Like he had his best year by far last year, but they still need to see him take another step. And so to me, that's also being like, okay, we probably need more to this position because we know that like AJ's developing and still becoming what we want him to be. He dealt with the weight issues and now is finally in like that right stage. So yeah, it is definitely.
And they lost their only double-digit sack guy at that position in Leonard Floyd, who left and went.
Which is a big loss.
Right. And he tailed off towards the end of last season, but he still was their starting guy at that position, which they didn't really replace. They kind of are running it back.
Yeah.
But with less. Yeah.
It's a major position of need, and certainly like that also depends on like where the board falls and that kind of thing, where it's like, okay, like, oh my gosh, I don't know what would happen if they traded up to draft a defensive player, but
pitchforks at one Bills drive.
I would fear for Brandon Beane's safety, but I think there's like a real case to it where like, I mean, safety alone, like, and I think that could be a position where it seems like there's more talent, like outside of Cooper DeJean. Like it seems like that they could wait on that and grab a guy later, but like it's a position that they still do need to address. Like Micah Hyde's like right now in a decision place, which is fine, but they have to plan like assuming he is not coming back, and that means that
and we don't even know if they want him back, really.
Right, and like what he would cost. There's a whole list of things, but basically like they need safety help, and like they do not have a young guy who it's like he is our starting safety of the future, and like I think they very much, I know they value that position. We know that from how much that, Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer meant to this team. So it's a position that like addressing that, like if they walk away from this draft and they don't address safety, like by round, I don't know, I'm not going to put a round on it, but I think they need to address it in a big way. And to me, that's like not as important as wide receiver, but it's still like a really important position for them to address.
I've spent lately way more time than I care to admit doing these online mock drafts just for fun. Like I get into the last couple of weeks and I'm like, all right, I'm going to really dig into this and learn more about a lot of these players that we study throughout the season, but kind of see how a board might fall. And I keep seeing the ability for the Bills to kind of do a little bit of everything. Like this is a draft where it seems like they could get all those things in one way, shape, or form. Now, they're all not going to be first round, second round picks, but like you're going to be able to address wide receiver if you want to. You're going to be able to address safety in the second and third round if you want to, maybe fourth. Some of the other positions, defensive tackle, defensive end. We haven't even gotten into the running back conversation yet.
That's a conversation?
Well, you heard me. I brought it up. This is the answer, the question I shouted over you to Brandon Beane at the end of last week.
I didn't know it was like an ongoing conversation.
No, it was just they need, I think, a third running back.
Sure.
Maybe more of a power, bigger back. I would not suggest that they do that in the first 2 days, but in the fourth, fifth round, I think a running back is fine, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
They don't have, they had Latavius Murray last year. They don't have that guy in the room. Sure. Yeah. Adding there would be good. They need someone so they don't have to use Josh Allen on third down to like run it on 3rd and 2. So they do need that guy. And unfortunately, it seems that like James Cook hasn't shown he can like fill in on that role.
They haven't asked him a ton to do it yet either.
Right.
So
right,
we'll
that's
see.
true. He's barely on the field on 3rd down. So yes, that is. I could see that. I think it could. Yes, a need to be addressed for sure.
Yeah. I've seen the guy from Notre Dame a
Okay.
whole lot, who's a bigger guy,
Yeah.
can pass block, all those things.
I could see them liking that. We know they like to run the ball.
If that's in the 4th or 5th round, that's another question about all of this, as we saw them run the ball much more with Joe Brady. Are they shifting slightly in their philosophy to where maybe that, and this goes back to the original point, do they need that alpha dog number one receiver? Or if their offensive philosophy is kind of shifting, can they get away with a bunch of specialized guys?
I mean, a good point on why like a third down running back that can really block, why that would be valued is we've barely even talked about it. I mean, like Dalton Kincaid should have like a really big role, like a much bigger role, maybe is a better way of saying it, a bigger role in the offense this year. And like then you need guys like you need is then the number one wide receiver as valuable? Like what is Dalton Kincaid's role? Like is it going to be so much so like such a great role in terms of like capacity, like a number of targets that like you can distract with guys like a third down running back where it's like, okay, you know, we don't need the flashy like big wide receiver that's going to take all the targets because Dalton Kincaid is going to be a version of that for us.
And maybe there you just need the threat of like somebody to take the top off to limit the doubles underneath on a guy like that on he and Shakir and whatever role they envisioned for Curtis Samuel. That'll be interesting.
Yep.
What would be like the craziest thing that you could realistically see them do? Like, of course, let me trade up to 2 to take a obviously they're not. We were joking around about this earlier.
They're going to take a quarterback,
right,
guys. Everyone get ready. They're not.
But what would be like you would be shocked to see happen in a realistic fashion? Like whatever that kind of move is.
I mean, I do think to an extent it is trading up for a position that like doesn't seem as high on the list. Like that to me is what it becomes realistic. Like a lot of national, and I'm technically national, but like I'm local national.
You're international. You're everywhere.
No. Like a lot of people who don't cover the Bills as often had projected them early in draft season with a cornerback. And like we all look at that and just shake our heads because it seems like, no, we know it to be like a far-fetched position. That is one of their more stacked rooms at this point. I mean, Christian Benford and Rasul Douglas are obviously the starters, and then you still have Kyrie. You know, like we could go down the list. That is not a room that is one of concern. So, like, I don't think they would do that, so I won't put cornerback in this category. Like, I think that is not in the realm of possibilities, but it is like trading up for someone like an edge rusher, like an offensive tackle, where it's like I think that's kind of, it's not crazy, and like maybe it doesn't quite meet what you were looking for.
No,
but
that's exactly it.
I think that is actually a possibility. Like I do think like we've seen Brandon Beane want so much to like, who thought that they were going to pick a tight end last year? Like when we were
Josh Allen did.
And then that's it. No. But like outside, like we weren't sitting here having a conversation about, oh, they're going to pick a tight end, partly because we didn't, it seems like Dalton Kincaid, might go earlier and whatever, but also that they had Dawson Knox, and like introducing more 12 personnel was a new idea and something they actually abandoned at the end of last year to an extent, but not the point. But like I'm saying that because I think if there is a guy that doesn't fit a position that we're sitting here having this conversation about, like I could see a scenario which like I think would be a little crazy, but a guy that they love, like even if it's a backup center, and they like that to me is like I could see it. I don't think it's going to happen, but it's within the realm of possibilities that, like, if there's a guy they have conviction of and he's dropping way more than they anticipated, going up and getting him, and it would be like, whoa, like, that's wild because he might not even play this year. Like a guy like a backup center, like a tackle, even like a defensive tackle.
Right.
Wouldn't start this year, but, like, would be there. And, like, that, to me, would be, like, I could see them doing it, unlikely, and it would be, like, we'd have to, like, analyze that and figure out, like, okay, did that make sense? Was that worthwhile? It depends on what they give up. But, like, I think that's a real possibility. Do you have one, though?
I go up and down on this because I would be shocked if they were willing to give up the haul to get, like, into the top 6 for a wide receiver. I would be shocked that they would do it, but at the same time, I wouldn't because Beane is super aggressive. I just think that's way too much, and I think they would think that's way too much for a non-quarterback. But I could see it happening. So I would be shocked in the moment, and we're all sitting there at 8:30, 8:45 on draft night, however the picks pan out, and the Bills are on the clock, a trade, right, with Arizona or the Giants and old friend Joe Shane or something like that, and you're like, oh my God, they're doing it, right? So you'd be shocked, but not surprised at the same time because we've talked about it so much and the idea of it. But it would be crazy to me if they did that, but not like completely out of the realm of possibility.
Would you be? I'm curious. Like, let's say they do that, and they give up, let's say, of course, 28, this year's second, next year's first, and let's say not their second round picks next year, not the one they got in the Diggs trade. Like, is that to you would be too much to move up?
Yes.
Okay.
For a wide receiver.
Okay.
That in a deep class of wide receivers, it's like, I don't know. Like Marvin Harrison Jr. is like the prototype wide receiver. Honestly, so is Odunze too. To me, could be awesome. So like, I would just have so many mixed feelings about that, just from my perspective of roster building and asset management. Mm-hmm. But maybe I'm too much of a nerd in that department to just be like, go do it, right? Go get the guy, and that's Josh Allen's guy for the next 5 to 10 years, right?
Yeah. I just think it's interesting, like, where the extra second, and it might not come into play until next year, and that's totally fine. But, like, it is, like, another impact of the Stephon Diggs trade. It was just so wild, by the way.
Right.
Is that they got this extra second-round pick in 25, and, like, how that comes into play, I just think will be really interesting. If it does, if it doesn't, like, that's, like, did they do that trade with, like, this thought of, like, oh, we could trade up and use it this year because they don't have that third-round pick. Like, I just think whether or not it's used will be really interesting and kind of telling maybe, and of course, they could be like, oh, we could use it to trade up and it didn't work out. But, like, if they do end up using it to do something, like, I just think it'll be another interesting component of that trade that, like, we won't see the full repercussions of for, like, a very long time. So.
Yeah, it's going to be wild either way. With the draft night's always fun like that with the trades, and you could see, well, we're working. So, but it's
no, it is fun. It's just like, even as a fan, like, I think it's like stressful. It's like anxiety inducing.
I agree.
An extent.
It's almost like you're in the fourth quarter of a big game, right? The whole time, because you're just waiting for your team. Are they going to make a move, or who are they going to take? So that's a lot of fun. That's why people love the draft, because it's all about, like, everyone has hope at that point, and it's fun in that way. And when you get into the season and your team stinks, you kind of lose that, and then, oh, this one guy could get us over next year, right? And there's always that chance that somebody does that. Looking around at the rest of the AFC East, we'll start with the Patriots sitting there at 3. Did they take the quarterback? Do you think they should?
Yes. I think they should take a quarterback. I think there's an interesting thing with them where if it's like trading back, like, would be interesting, because it's like, it just depends which quarterback they want. It seems to be the vibe of. But they're certainly in an interesting spot where it's like, okay, are you comfortable with Jacoby Brissett being your probably starting quarterback this year, or are they kind of again? Are they kind of like in a we're gonna sit this year out kind of vibe, like just kind of build up? I could see that, which is very hard for Patriots fans, not Bills fans. So yeah, I think that getting a quarterback team, they have to almost, like, they're in a spot where it's like they don't have, like, and if they leave the first round without a quarterback, it's like, okay, like, why did you have the third pick? Like, you need to get a quarterback. So yes, I
can't see them being that high in the draft and not doing it. Yeah. When you're that high, you almost have to do it unless you
don't know when
you have
you'll
a
be
guy.
Back.
Right. You don't know when you're going to be up that high, and if you don't like Drake May, or maybe you do trade back and get one of the other guys, Michael Penix or Bo Nix or whoever, right? And then the Jets, they're interesting because they're sitting there at 10. Everyone's mocking Brock Bowers to them, the tight end out of Georgia. They could go a bunch of different ways, though.
Who knows with the Jets? That's like the Jets will forever remain.
They're such a weird team.
Yeah. They're such, like, they've got so much talent on that team from their drafts. That's why it's like, okay, like, they've done a really good job of drafting. They're at least they're high picks. Like, they have been very successful as of late. So you do think that, like, okay, whatever direction they choose to go in, like, if it is, that could make sense. It could be, like, 4 different ways. Is that a team that would trade back? Like, I think it does depend. Like, there's so many question marks with those picks. And, like, I feel like after, like, even with 3, like we talked about the Patriots, like, they could take a quarterback there, or they could, like, that's when it starts getting, like, a little fuzzy. But I think, they want to win with Aaron Rodgers. So to me, it's like, who they're going to target, like someone who can help them now. And it's less of like a, they would know Aaron Rodgers isn't getting younger. Or wiser,
right.
I'll add in. Because
Aaron Rodgers, let's go that
no,
road for
please.
all the engagement in a bad way.
Anyway,
yes.
But like I do think that's their priority. So if they can get someone who they think will help him win games, like I think that's the direction they go. And what if a wide receiver falls? Like I mean, that's not like their greatest position of need, certainly, but if it's an exciting guy, they want to give Aaron Rodgers all the help he can get, an offensive lineman. Like I just think there's like that to me is more open-ended, where it's like they want to help. Whatever they have to do to win now is kind of where they go.
And I could even see them, I don't expect it, but I could see them trading back because they have so many different ways they could go. They don't have like an absolute huge hole. They addressed a lot of their offensive line issues supposedly in the offseason. We'll see how that works out once you get there, but you can always use an influx of new talent. Miami's really interesting too because they're like a team that has all these flashy parts, but they're going to retool on defense. Jordan Poyer's down there now. I mean, what do you make of Miami? And they've got a lot of places to go. I've seen Cooper DeJean go to them a lot too.
Their offseason was wild and in a way that like I haven't really been able to fully digest because they did lose a lot of like defensive players specifically. And like how they go about addressing that is really fascinating. Like, is it a defensive lineman? Like, I think they obviously need help there.
Christian Wilkins gone. So,
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Right.
Losing big name guys. I believe, don't quote me, in our mock draft we did with NFL Nation, my colleague and former Bills reporter Marcel Louis-Jacques did pick a defensive tackle to go to them. Don't quote me on that. I believe he did. But also, like, I think offensive line is a spot for them. Like, I just think they're a weird one where it's like they did lose so much talent that it seems like, defense could make a lot of sense. But they could go like 4 different ways and address like a position of need because they had a weird offseason of like departures. And like that's why like something like Jordan Poyer's like they got older at some spots. So it seems like they need like younger talent. Xavier Howard's gone, like people like that where it's like they could address different positions in so many ways that they're the Dolphins and the Jets. I mean, this division really has turned into like I think you could put the Patriots in like their own corner right now because they're clearly like in a stage of like new head coach, kind of getting back to where they want to be. But like between the Jets, Dolphins, and Bills, it's like they're all in such weird phases of like not where they were last year, and like because the Jets are so unknown with Aaron Rodgers, like it's like. Okay, where like they're adding new talent and like they need these positions where they like lost key guys. Like Christian Wilkins alone is like such a huge loss. And how they address that like in the draft, like if it's defensive tackle, that would make a lot of sense to me.
And defense kind of let them down towards the end of last season. Injuries played a huge role in that for them. Let's not get it twisted there. You still wonder a little bit, like that little 1% of like, are they completely on the Tua train, right? Would they do something like that? That would be crazy, right?
Crazy.
Yeah.
But you never know. I also think, like, quarterbacks, there's got to be a surprise, right? It feels like every year there's, like, a surprise, like, guys positions where it's like, oh, I'm surprised that team went with X. Like, even, like, when the tight end thing came out with the Bills, that was, I'm sure for a lot of people, like, whoa, like, why would they do that? They have Dawson Knox. And it's like, no, there's, like, a reason that they have. And it's like, I think oftentimes we forget that, where it's like, not forget that, but it doesn't get as talked about because you're analyzing, oh, this is their needs, this is how they could address that. But sometimes their needs aren't, like, the position that we perceive to have the least talent. Like, it's like they do have conviction on a guy that they, like, fell in love with at a position that they have players at, and they still want to address it. So I think that always shakes up the draft board because it's like, no, they really loved this guy, even though they have 18 wide receivers. Like, they love this guy. So that's why the draft is fun, because you can't actually predict it. So, yeah. We
talked a few minutes ago about, like, the draft being stressful for fans, right? So before you were a reporter, like, did you sit and were like, you were a draft nerd, or like, what did you do on draft night?
That's a great question. Not like a draft nerd like some people are. Like, I wasn't as big into like the mocks and like definitely because I did not grow up in a big college football family, so like I didn't get really into like I just didn't know many of the guys like before they got drafted. So, but definitely draft night, like I loved. It's like I miss it a little bit, like just being able to watch it and enjoy the draft, because it is so, especially night one, like it's just so much fun to see like what chaos ensues. And but so definitely would watch it. just want to see what happens. Definitely, like, it is because you see, like, you're like, oh, that guy would have been good. Like, that position was one of need, and then they go off the board, and it's like, oh, no, like, what's going to happen? So I definitely do miss that because covering it is just, I love my job, and I love covering the draft. I think it's one of my favorite things to do to actually, I don't like the lead up because it's a little too much speculation for me.
As we're doing right now.
Yes, but it's like, which is necessary and important to do. But I personally enjoy a little bit more actually covering, like, what happens. So it is fun to cover. It's just like a little bit of a different vibe because then you have to be ready to work and like not snacking on beers
right.
and that kind of stuff.
That's exactly it. So I'm old enough to remember when the draft was not during the week and it was on Saturdays and Sundays.
Okay.
So the first round, like when I was in college, the first round would be on Saturday. And I think the first few rounds, the first 3 maybe, were on Saturday. And so, like, when I'm in college, we would get up, and the draft starts at noon on Saturday, and we're, drinking beers at 10 o'clock in the morning. And I went to college in Ohio, so, like, it was a ton of, like, Browns fans and Bengals fans, and I grew up in Western New York. So at the time, like, I grew up a Bills fan. I don't make any bones about that. Just transition to media, and you kind of put that aside. So, like, everybody's wearing their jerseys and just having a party and watching the draft. So that was kind of fun. And then covering it nighttime and when they switch to during the week on Thursday nights, that's really cool too for fans, and they have all these draft parties and things like that. So it's really like the biggest thing of the year outside of the games, and sometimes I think people like the off season more than they like the actual season.
Yeah, I mean, it is like you had said earlier, like the options are completely open where it's like your team, like let's say like Bryce Young last year with the Panthers, like it was like, oh, they could be so good this, like the potential's endless. And I think that is part of why the draft is so exciting, because it's like my team just got this guy, and now think of all the ways they can use him and how exciting it is. And like it is really exciting to have new players. Like it's new players to get into. It's new like ways to think about, oh, this is how your team could do this. And I think it is such an exciting time. It's nice to actually be able to be like, these I also think about sometimes, and this is probably overthinking it, but like I feel bad, these prospects, like what they're going through, like I can't imagine like the anxiety of going through like this whole process and like on their end, like what it's like finally being with a team and like how exciting that must be, and like not having the stress of like being poked and prodded.
Right. And I'll never forget, even on draft night, I'll never forget when Josh Allen was drafted, and it had come out that there was a inflammatory, construed as racist tweet from his past that had surfaced right before the draft, and we're all doing one-on-ones with him, each station, each local affiliate, and every one of us is asking him about that. That's draft night, and he had to like deal with that. Now he made his own bed there, and he did that, and he owned up to it. But all those sorts of questions and things like that, or like the guy with the weed gas mask, right? Many, many years ago. That was crazy too, like video surfaces of that. And just it's crazy season, but it's fun. It's why fans really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's anything can happen kind of time. So it's like it goes all over the place, and I think that is also, it's unpredictability makes it fun, right? Because like we try to predict it, and then you just don't know. So then it's like, all right, we can talk about it, and like we should, and like project and all that stuff, but then just be prepared for like any possibilities to happen. That's why it's fun. If we knew exactly what was going to happen, it wouldn't be as fun. But we can chat about it and do our best.
Yeah,
so.
well, let's all get ready for the Bills to draft a center in the first round.
No, they like go like quarterback, and like they draft like a running back in the first round, and
a tight end.
Oh my god, a tight end.
They trade up for Brock Bowers, right?
Oh no.
We've got the 3 best tight ends in the NFL. No one can compete with us.
Running 13 personnel.
Oh my god, amazing. All right, well that's going to wrap it up for our pre-draft edition of the Buffalo End Zone podcast. We thank Alaina Getzenberg of ESPN for stopping by and sharing some time with us. Of course, like and subscribe to the page on YouTube, Facebook. You can find our podcast wherever you normally watch your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, all that good stuff. We'll be back Friday morning with another little quick mini reaction podcast to the Bills' presumptive first-round pick. Once they make it, we presume they're going to do so. But for now, for Alaina Getzenberg, Kevin Carroll's on the men. Get better, buddy. We'll see you next time on the Buffalo End Zone podcast.